Tonight, I want to talk about something that's extremely important. I wish people wouldn't just watch 3 minutes of a video and turn it off. But I understand when people go to YouTube, they just want to feel good and they just want to relax and they want to be entertained. And I wish I had better B-roll for you guys to watch so you didn't have to stare at me the whole time. But I'm not at that production level. Sorry. But this is important stuff. Stuff you're going to need to know. So tonight I want to talk about Romans 13, the law of love and civil disobedience. Because you're probably going to be faced with these issues at some point, especially the way the world's going lately. So you need to know this stuff. So we'll start with Romans 13. Romans 13 basically says, the first two verses tell us that we need to submit to governing authorities. And we need to not resist them, because if you resist the governing authorities, then you're resisting the ordinance of God. Okay? It basically says that those governing authorities that exist are established by God, and if you resist them, you're resisting God and you will incur condemnation. Okay? So, if that's the case, then how do you explain all these other stories in the Bible? I'm going to give you 5 examples. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, 5 examples in the Bible. Okay, we're going to start at the beginning of the Bible and move towards the end, okay, that show people doing exact opposite of what Romans 13 says to do. And most of these people ended up as heroes of the faith as a result. Okay, which tells us that we have to have a better understanding of Romans 13. Which, if you read past verses 1 and 2 in Romans 13, and you read up till like verse 7 or so, you'll see that it's more complex than just assuming that whatever governing authorities are there are established by God and you have to do what they say. Because that's the problem right there. If you assume that every governing authority that exists is established by God and you have to do what they say, you're in trouble. Okay? That's the point of this video. You can't make that mistake. Okay? Romans 13, it says a lot. Okay? And the thing it says is that true authority is from God if there's real authority and you don't want to resist God's authority. But it also says, that those authorities are ministers of God to punish wrongdoing and reward right doing. So the key is to know when they're no longer being ministers of God and they're no longer punishing wrongdoing and rewarding right doing. Okay? And they've become ministers of God's enemies. They've become God's enemies and they're rewarding wrongdoing and punishing right doing. At that point, right? We no longer submit to them because they are not God's authority at that point. That's what you have to understand. You have to read Romans 13, verses 1 through about 7. I think let's look it up. And you have to take all those verses. You can't just assume that Romans 13, 1 and 2 are the entirety of the meaning of what it's saying. Okay? You can't do that, because if you do that, you're in trouble. And I'm going to show you why. I'm going to give you 5 examples, okay? So yeah, you need to go all the way through verse 6, okay? I'm just going to read it. Please listen. Because so many people, over 35 years in Christian culture, I've heard people make this mistake, and here's what they do. They assume that whoever's in power, president, governors, authorities, whatever, they're like, oh, God put him there, and I have to do what he says. But sometimes those people are telling you to do ridiculous things that are anti-God. So you have to understand this. And then I'm going to get to those 5 examples to prove it. And I'm going to talk about how the law of love works in there, okay? So Romans 13 says, Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers. This must be the King James. Well, whatever. For there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. I don't like this version. Please wait. There's a better version. Let's try this one. Today's English version. Okay, let's try this, because there's no need to stick with the King James, because you need the spiritual truth. You don't need the these and thous and the thys and this. There's no more accuracy. Accuracy comes from the Spirit of truth, not the version you read. Don't buy into that when people tell you have to read this version. No, you don't. You need to listen to the Spirit of truth to give you the right version. So this is today's English version. Yeah. Romans 13. Everyone must obey state authorities because no authority exists without God's permission. And the existing authorities have been put there by God. Okay, that's verse 1. Whoever opposes the existing authority opposes what God has ordered, and anyone who does so will bring judgment on himself. Okay? That's those first two verses. And people camp there. You can't camp there. You got to read the rest of it. For rulers are not to be feared by those who do good, but by those who do evil. The rulers need to stick with that. Would you like to be unafraid of the man in authority? Then do what is good, and he will praise you, if he's really God's authority. Because he will praise you, because he is God's servant working for your own good. If he is truly God's servant. I'm paraphrasing. Right? Maybe I shouldn't paraphrase, okay. Then do what is good, and he will praise you, because he is God's servant working for your own good. But if you do evil, then be afraid of him, because his power to punish is real. Okay? He is God's servant and carries out God's punishment on those who do evil. For this reason, you must obey the authorities, not just because of God's punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. Okay? This is why you pay taxes, because the authorities are working for God when they fulfill their duties. Okay? When they fulfill their duties. That's the key. So basically they're saying that the authorities are ministers of God, they punish evil, and they reward good. Okay? And that's when they are God's authorities and you submit to them. But when the authorities are not doing that, when the authorities are not living up to their role, which is described in verses 3 through 6 there, we don't do what verses 1 and 2 say. Or you get in trouble. Here's your 5 examples. In Exodus, the king, Pharaoh, ordered that all of the firstborn Hebrew children be killed because he was afraid that the Israelites were going to take over. Okay? The Hebrews, as they called them back then. He's like, oh my God, they're going to take us over. And so he told the midwives to kill all the male children that were born. There were 2 midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, I believe are their names. Check it in Exodus 1. And he's like, but they didn't do it. They didn't kill the firstborn males, right? And when the king, Pharaoh, came and asked him, he's like, hey, why didn't you kill all these boys like I told you to? They made up an excuse and they lied to him. They said, oh, it's because the Hebrew women are more vigorous than the Egyptian women, and we can't get to them in time. They just made up some lie. Okay? So they resisted his authority and they lied to him. Okay? But if you look at how God treated those women, it says in there that God blessed those women and established families for them because they did that. Okay? Okay, that's your first example. And in that example, we see the law of love overriding God's lower laws. God's lower laws say submit to authority, don't lie. They broke both those laws. They didn't intentionally break them, but they went beyond those 2 lower laws for the higher law, the law of love, that said, no, we're going to obey God because God is love, and he's saying not to kill all the firstborn males, or kill all the males, okay, that were born. They deferred to the law of love when those 2 lower laws were not in line with God's love. You see that? That's what you have to understand. Okay? And we learn to live in the law of love as we live with God, in relationship with him. Second example, okay? You go 1 chapter later, you see Moses' parents doing the same thing. So the king, Pharaoh, the same guy, gave another command that all the male children and the whole of all the Hebrews were to be thrown in the Nile. Same thing, he's trying to keep their population down, right? Okay? Kind of like, anyways, so kind of like some people are doing today. I'm not going to name any names, but you can fill in the blanks. So, anyways, the king said, throw them all in the Nile. And Moses' parents said, no, we're not going to do that, right? They resisted the king's authority. They did not do what he told them to do. Were they breaking Romans 13, 1 and 2? Yes. Why? Because Pharaoh was not being a minister of God and punishing evil and rewarding good. Okay? So again, Moses' parents went above the law of submitting to the governing authorities, and they deferred to the law of love, which says, no, this law is not in accordance with love. We're going to this law, which is. You have to learn to do the same. How do you do so? By living in love with God in relationship with him. You learn to live by the law of love, just as God does. And just as anybody does who lives in relationship with him. Getting the point? Third example. I'm going to go to the book of Joshua, okay? The Israelites are at this point conquering the promised land. They're attacking Jericho. They send in 2 spies. The two spies, they end up at a prostitute's house named Rahab. Rahab harbors them, hides them, right? And when the king of Jericho finds out, he sends messengers over. He says, hey, bring those 2 guys out. We know what they're up to. And she flat out lies to them. She says, oh, she resists authority and lies to him. She's like, no, they were here, but they're gone. No, they went over there. Go chase them. Check the story. That's what she says, right? So she resisted authority. She broke Romans 13:1, and she lied. Which is another of God's commands: don't lie, right? But she's a hero of the faith. Okay, she's a hero of the faith, just like Moses' parents were heroes of the faith in Hebrews 11. Okay. Why? Because she understood that those 2 lower laws were no longer in effect, but she needed to defer to God's higher law of love. Okay? At this point, it was love for God, right? She's like, oh, I'm going to serve you, right? So what was God's response? Did he punish her for resisting authority and for lying? No. He saved her and her whole household. He saved her parents, her brothers, her sisters. Check it in Joshua 6. Okay? Here's another example. I know I'm going on long, but you need to understand this. I'm telling you, you're going to have to know this in life. Especially with what's all going on in the world right now. You have to understand this. Next example is Daniel and his 3 friends. We'll just go with his 3 friends. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That was their given names. Their actual Hebrew names were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, I believe. Anyways, everybody knows them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Whatever. 3 Hebrew guys. Nebuchadnezzar the king sets up a big golden idol, says everybody's going to worship this idol. They're like, no, we're not going to worship the idol. We worship God. Okay? That king was their governing authority. They resisted his authority. They said, no, we're not doing what you do. Were they breaking Romans 13, 1 and 2? Technically. Why? Because Nebuchadnezzar was no longer being a minister of God and rewarding good and punishing evil. He was being an enemy of God and rewarding evil and punishing good. So at that point, those 3 guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, deferred to the highest law, the law of love. They said, nope, this law is no longer in effect. We're going with the highest law, and we're going to go with love for God. You have to learn to do the same. Last example, Peter and John in the book of Acts. They were preaching Jesus, they were preaching Christ, and they had healed a guy at the temple, and their governing authorities, they happen to be religious governing authorities, the scribes and the Pharisees, right? They were authorities in their culture, said, hey, you guys need to stop this. We order you to stop. And they're like, well, whether it's right to obey you or to obey God, you be the judge, but we're not going to stop. Did they break Romans 13, 1 and 2? Technically. Why? Because their authorities were no longer being ministers of God, they were no longer rewarding good and punishing evil. They were being enemies of God and rewarding evil and punishing good. So Peter and John said, nope, we're not doing it. We're going to the highest law, the law of love for God, because they got to know Jesus and God through him, and they said, we're living by the law of love. You have to know how to do the same. Because if you just believe Romans 13, 1 and 2, that every governing authority, you have to do exactly what they say, and they start telling you to do things that are clearly anti-Christ and anti-God, you will be in trouble. You have to understand this. Especially with where the world is going today. Thank you and have a nice day.